The black farmer was laughed out of the luxury hangar by executives. But when he opened his old leather wallet, the entire room went dead silent. George Washington Miller's mudcake pickup truck stood out like a sore thumb in the pristine parking lot of Elite Aviation's private jet hangar. The morning sun reflected off the polished glass building, making him squint as he turned off the engine. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel one last time before reaching for the worn leather portfolio on the passenger seat. The air conditioning hit his face as he pushed through the glass doors, bringing with it the sharp scent of leather and metal. His work boots left faint traces on the polished marble floor. The straw hat, darkened with years of sweat around the brim, remained firmly on his head. "Sir, the service entrance is around back," the young receptionist called out, not bothering to look up from her computer screen. George cleared his throat. "I have an appointment. George Miller, here to see Mr. Bradford about the Citation XLS." Her manicured fingers stopped typing. She looked up, eyes widening slightly as she took in his appearance. The faded denim overalls, the cotton shirt with a slight tear at the elbow, dirt still fresh under his fingernails from the morning's work. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice tight. "Mr. Bradford handles our executive clients." "No mistake." George's voice remained steady as he pulled out a business card. "Called last week. Got the confirmation email right here." He reached into his pocket, producing a printed copy. The receptionist's eyes darted between the email and George's face. She picked up the phone, pressing a button with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Bradford? There's a gentleman here. Says he has an appointment about the citation." She paused, listening. "Yes, a Mr. Miller." Another pause. "I understand, but his insisting." She glanced up at George. "Yes, sir. I'll tell him." She set the phone down, plastering on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Bradford will be with you shortly. Please have a seat." George nodded, settling his frame into one of the leather chairs. They creaked under his weight, unused to hosting someone of his solid build. He placed his portfolio carefully on his lap, running one calloused thumb over its surface. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the hangar where various private jets gleamed under bright lights. A memory flickered, him at 12, watching crop dusters sweep low over his father's fields. Now, at 65, he was here to buy something that could fly twice as high as those old planes. The sound of expensive shoes on marble pulled his attention back. Thomas Bradford emerged from a side door, his tailored suit a stark contrast to George's work clothes. The sales executive's eyes scanned the waiting area, passed over George, then returned with poorly concealed surprise. "Mr. Miller." Bradford's voice carried a note of disbelief. George stood, extending his hand. "That's right." Bradford hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting the handshake, his grip noticeably light as if afraid of dirt transferring from George's palm to his. "Follow me, please." Bradford turned without waiting for a response, leading the way through glass doors toward the hangar. "Though I should mention, our aircraft start at several $1,000,000. Perhaps I could direct you to our charter services instead. Just here to see the citation, like we discussed on the phone." George matched Bradford's pace, ignoring the sideways glances from other employees they passed. The hangar air carried the scent of jet fuel and new leather. Their footsteps echoed off the high ceiling as they approached the sleek white jet positioned under spotlights. Other potential buyers in business attire milled around, their conversations dying down as George and Bradford passed. "The Citation XLS Plus," Bradford began, his tone shifting to something between condescending and impatient. "Starting price is $12.5 million. This particular model. What's the fuel consumption at cruising altitude?" George interrupted, eyes focused on the aircraft's wings. Bradford blinked. "I'm sorry. Fuel consumption. And the maximum payload with full tanks." "Well," Bradford shuffled through some papers on his tablet. "The XLS Plus typically burns. Should be around 170 gallons per hour at 45,000 feet, George said, walking around the nose of the aircraft. "Payload about 1,100 pounds with full fuel, if I remember right." Bradford's mouth opened slightly, then closed. A small group of well-dressed observers had gathered nearby, watching the exchange with unconcealed interest. "You seem familiar with aviation," Bradford managed. "Flew C-130s in the Air Force." George ran his hand along the aircraft's smooth fuselage. "Before going back to farming, this'll do just fine for moving between my operations in Texas and California." A sharp laugh cut through the hangar. "Operations?" Did he say operations? The voice belonged to a man in an expensive suit, standing with a small group of other potential buyers. His comment sparked several poorly concealed smirks. Bradford cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller, perhaps we should." "The avionics package," George continued, ignoring the onlookers. "This one's got the Garmin G5000. Yes, but good. Better than the Proline 21 for what I need." George pulled his reading glasses from his pocket, perching them on his nose as he studied the wing design. Range is about 2,100 nautical miles. The growing audience watched the exchange like a tennis match, their expressions a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Bradford's professional demeanor was cracking under the strange situation. A farmer in muddy boots discussing complex aviation specifications in his pristine hangar. "Mr. Miller," Bradford tried again, "while we appreciate your interest, perhaps we should discuss some preliminary qualifications before proceeding further." George turned from his inspection of the landing gear. "Like what?" "Well, financial considerations. For one, we typically require proof of, already sent all that last week," George cut in. "Should be in the file with my appointment." Bradford's tablet slipped slightly in his hands. He tapped the screen several times, color rising in his cheeks as he scrolled through emails. The hangar doors opened with a hydraulic hiss. A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit strode in, his presence causing an immediate shift in the atmosphere. Employees straightened their postures. Bradford's face paled slightly. "Tom," the man called out, his voice carrying across the space. "How's our XLS showing going?" His eyes landed on George, and his stride faltered for just a moment. "Mr. Whitman," Bradford stammered. "I was just explaining to Mr. Miller here about our qualification process." "Miller?" Whitman's eyebrows rose as he approached. He looked George up and down, taking in the mud-stained boots, the worn overalls, the old straw hat. "And you're here about the citation?" George met his gaze steadily. "That's right." A smile spread across Whitman's face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, isn't this interesting? Tell me, Mr. Miller, what brings a farmer to my showroom?" The hangar had gone quiet. Even the distant sound of aircraft outside seemed muted. George felt the weight of every eye on him, the same weight he'd felt countless times before in rooms where he wasn't expected to belong. "Same thing that brings anyone else," George replied calmly. "Looking to buy a jet." Whitman's laugh echoed off the hangar walls. Several others joined in nervously. "A jet?" Whitman repeated, turning to address the gathered crowd. "Did you hear that? Our friend here is looking to buy a jet." He turned back to George. "Tell me, what kind of farming pays for a $12 million aircraft?" George's hand tightened slightly on his portfolio. "The profitable kind." The laughter grew louder. Whitman stepped closer, his expensive cologne mixing with the hangar's mechanical smells. "Mr. Miller," he said, voice dripping with mock concern, "this is a serious business. We sell aircraft to CEOs, celebrities, real business owners. Not." He gestured at George's clothing, farm hands playing dress-up. Bradford shifted uncomfortably beside them. The audience watched with a mixture of embarrassment and morbid fascination. George stood his ground, decades of similar moments flowing through his memory. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. "They'll judge you by your cover until they are forced to read the book." Whitman was still talking. "Perhaps we could direct you to some more appropriate transportation options. I hear pickup trucks are quite popular in agricultural circles." More laughter. George felt his neck growing hot, but his voice remained steady. "I'd like to continue the tour, if you don't mind." "Oh, he'd like to continue," Whitman announced to the crowd. He turned back to George, all pretense of politeness gone. "Listen here, you're in the wrong place. This isn't some tractor showroom or livestock auction. These are sophisticated machines for sophisticated buyers. Now, I suggest you." George's hand moved to his back pocket, where his worn leather wallet sat. The same wallet he'd had for 20 years, its surface cracked and smooth from countless transactions, from buying his first acre to his most recent expansion. The movement caught Whitman's eye. "What's this? Going to show us your life savings?" His voice carried through the hangar. "How much does a poor farmer make these days, anyway?" Bradford cleared his throat in the tense silence. "Sir, if we could return to the presentation." No, Whitman interrupted, waving his hand. "Let's see what our farming friend has to show us." His smile was sharp as a blade. though I doubt it'll cover even the deposit on this fine machine. George's fingers worked the leather wallet open slowly, methodically, just as he did everything else in life. The crowd leaned forward slightly, anticipating the moment of humiliation. "Should we get security?" someone whispered loudly enough to carry. "Way ahead of you," another voice responded. Two guards had appeared near the hangar entrance, their postures alert. George pulled out a single folded document. The paper was crisp, official-looking, completely at odds with his weathered wallet. He held it out to Whitman without a word. Whitman snatched it, unfolding it with theatrical flourish. His eyes scanned the page, then scanned it again. The smirk faltered. "This is—" He looked up at George, then back at the paper. "This has to be some mistake." "No mistake," George said quietly. "Just like there was no mistake about my appointment." Bradford edged closer, trying to peek at the document. "Mr. Whitman, this is a bank statement," Whitman said slowly, "from First National Agricultural Banking." He swallowed hard, showing liquid assets of $57,400,000 and change. George finished for him. "That's not counting the equipment, land holdings, or this year's projected harvest revenue." The hangar went dead silent. Someone dropped a tablet, the clatter echoing off the high ceiling. "But you—" Whitman gestured helplessly at George's clothes. "A farmer." George adjusted his hat slightly. "That's right. Been one all my life. Started with 20 acres and a dream. Now Miller Agricultural supplies 20% of the organic produce to major chains across 3 states." He turned to Bradford. "Which is why I need the jet. Can't keep depending on commercial flights to check on operations." Bradford practically sprinted forward. "Of course, Mr. Miller. Let me show you the interior features." "Hold on," Whitman interrupted, his face flushed. "We still need to verify." "Already did," Bradford said quickly, his tablet suddenly active in his hands. "All the documentation came through last week. Full financial background, credit check, everything." He laughed nervously. "It's all in order. Very much in order." The other potential buyers were murmuring among themselves now, their phones out, presumably Googling Miller Agricultural. "Found it," a woman in a business suit announced. "They're one of the largest organic farming operations in the Southwest. Major supplier to Whole Foods, Trader Joe's." She looked up at George with new eyes. "They won the Sustainable Agriculture Award last year." George remembered that ceremony. He'd worn a suit that day, but it hadn't felt right. These overalls, this hat, they were who he was, who he'd always been. "Now," he said, turning back to the aircraft, "about that fuel consumption data." Bradford practically tripped over himself getting to the specifications panel. Yes. As you correctly noted, at cruising altitude." "Hold up," came a new voice. A couple in matching business attire approached, the woman's heels clicking on the hangar floor. "We were here first, actually. We've been waiting to discuss purchase terms," the man nodded. "That's right. We have a meeting scheduled." "Nonsense." Bradford cut in. "Mr. Miller's interests take priority. He's one of our most qualified buyers today." The same people who had been smirking at George minutes ago were now trying to position themselves closer, business cards appearing in hands. "Mr. Miller," called out a man in an expensive suit, "have you considered expanding into the Midwest?" "My investment firm, please," another interrupted. "Mr. Miller, I represent a major distribution network." George held up his hand, silencing the sudden onslaught of attention. "Still hear about the jet?" He pointed to a panel near the wing. "That access port, maintenance schedule, every 200 flight hours," Bradford replied quickly. "Though our service package includes, same as the older models then," George nodded. "Good. Mechanics won't need special training." Whitman stood frozen, the bank statement still in his hand. His face had gone from red to pale and back again. "Mr. Miller," he finally managed, "perhaps we got off on the wrong foot." "Nothing wrong with my feet," George replied, not looking at him. "Been carrying me through fields for 6 to 5 years. Through Vietnam. Through droughts and floods. Through boardrooms and bank meetings." He turned his gaze to Whitman. "Through every door people like you said I didn't belong behind." A young executive near the back let out a low whistle. Someone else coughed uncomfortably. "The interior," George continued, addressing Bradford. "Show me the cargo configuration." "Of course." Bradford rushed to open the aircraft's door. "Right this way, sir." As George climbed the stairs into the jet, He caught fragments of whispered conversations behind him. Can't believe we almost. Did you see that bank statement? My firm needs to reach out. Who would have thought a farmer? The jet's interior smelled of new leather and money. Bradford was rattling off features like his life depended on it. Full galley here, convertible sleeping area, state-of-the-art entertainment system, cargo capacity, George reminded him. Need to know it can handle sampling crates during harvest season. Yes, yes. The cargo door dimensions are. George ran his hand along the polished surfaces, remembering the first time he'd seen a private jet up close. He'd been fueling them at the local airstrip, working extra hours between harvests. The owners would barely look at him then, just like today. Now he was standing in one, about to buy it. Through the window, he could see Whitman in heated discussion with his staff. The CEO's gestures were agitated, his face still flushed. The security guards had disappeared from the entrance. And with the rear seats removed, you'll have approximately 68 cubic feet of cargo space, Bradford was saying. More than enough for your sampling needs, I'd imagine. George nodded, doing the mental calculations. It would work. The numbers added up, just like they had on paper when he'd first considered this purchase. Mr. Miller? A hesitant voice came from the cabin door. One of the younger executives stood there, tablet in hand. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I took the liberty of pulling up Miller Agricultural's expansion reports from last quarter. I must say, your vertical integration strategy is remarkable. George turned to face him. Nothing remarkable about hard work and good sense. But the way you've structured the organic certification process across multiple states. Time for that later, Bradford interrupted. Mr. Miller is focusing on the aircraft now. He turned to George with an eager smile. Shall we discuss the purchase agreement? Outside, more people had gathered in the hangar. Word had spread quickly. George could see phones out, pictures being taken, probably already circulating through social media. Tomorrow there'd be stories about this moment, about the farmer who walked into a private jet hangar and shocked everyone. But that wasn't why he was here. One more thing, George said, moving toward the cockpit. Need to check the pilot's sight lines. Used to flying cargo planes in weather a lot worse than this bird will ever see. Bradford's eyes widened. You plan to fly it yourself. Got my commercial license 30 years ago. Keep it current. George settled into the pilot's seat, his hands finding the familiar positions on the controls. Been flying crop dusters since before you were born, son. The leather seat adjusted to his frame, the controls positioned just where they should be. Through the windscreen, he could see the hangar stretching out before him, and beyond that, the sky he'd loved since childhood. A commotion at the cabin door drew his attention. Whitman had returned, his composure somewhat restored. Mr. Miller, he said, his voice dripping with forced politeness. I believe we should discuss terms in my office. Private conversation. You understand. George remained in the pilot's seat, his calloused hands still on the controls. Nothing private about business, Mr. Whitman. Never has been, in my experience. Bradford nervously shuffled some papers. The standard purchase agreement. Standard won't cut it, Whitman interrupted. Mr. Miller deserves our premium treatment. The way he said it made it clear. They were scrambling to save face, to turn this situation to their advantage somehow. The same dance George had seen countless times before, when people realized their first impressions had cost them dearly. The agreement in my file will do just fine, George said, finally standing from the pilot's seat. Already had my lawyers review it last week. Whitman's smile faltered again. Your lawyers? Williams and Roberts, George replied. They handle all my equipment purchases. Good firm. Fair. He paused. Unlike some other folks I've met today. The implication hung in the air like summer humidity before a storm. Whitman's face went through several shades of red again. Bradford's hands trembled slightly as he arranged the purchase documents on the jet's side table. The cabin had become crowded. Whitman, 2 assistants, and several executives all trying to position themselves near George. Perhaps we should clear the aircraft, Bradford suggested, wiping sweat from his forehead. Give Mr. Miller some space to review the terms. Actually, Whitman cut in, I think we should move this to the conference room. More appropriate setting. George remained in his seat, eyes scanning the first page of the contract. Here's fine. An assistant leaned in to whisper something in Whitman's ear. His face tightened. Through the cabin windows, George could see more people gathering in the hangar, Phone's out, talking animatedly. Mr. Miller. Whitman tried again, his tone carefully measured. Given the significance of this transaction, I really think. Significance? George looked up from the papers. It's just business, Mr. Whitman. Like buying a tractor or a combine. Only difference is the price tag. Someone in the back of the cabin poorly suppressed a laugh. Whitman's neck reddened. Just business, he snapped. This is a $12 million aircraft. This isn't some farm equipment purchase. The cabin went quiet. George set the contract down slowly. Farm equipment? He stood up, his frame filling the narrow space. My newest combined harvester cost $1.2 million. Got 6 of those. Latest irrigation system? $8 million for the main property alone. That farm equipment you're talking down about? It feeds half this country. Whitman took a step back, bumping into an assistant who scrambled to maintain his balance. Now see here, Whitman started, but George wasn't finished. You look at these clothes and see someone who doesn't belong. George brushed a bit of morning soil from his overall strap. I look at them and see 40 years of dawn-to-dusk work. See the empire I built while people like you were laughing. Bradford cleared his throat nervously. The purchase agreement, Mr. Miller. One moment. George turned back to Whitman. You wanted to know about a farmer's money? Let me tell you about money, Mr. Whitman. Last year, Miller Agricultural grossed $280 million. Year before that, 245. Started with 20 acres of corn and a second-hand tractor held together with baling wire and prayer. The cabin had grown impossibly quiet. Even the hangar outside seemed to be holding its breath. But that's not what bothers you, is it? George continued, his voice level but carrying steel underneath. What bothers you is that someone like me walked into your shiny hangar and didn't ask permission to belong here. This is outrageous, Whitman sputtered. I won't be lectured in my own facility by a what? George asked quietly. Go ahead. Say it. The tension in the cabin could have been cut with a knife. Several executives found sudden interest in their shoes. Bradford looked like he wanted to disappear into the upholstery. Whitman's mouth worked silently for a moment before he managed, by someone who clearly doesn't understand our corporate culture. Corporate culture? George picked up his hat, turning it in his hands. Let me tell you about culture, Mr. Whitman. My grandfather was a sharecropper. Worked land he didn't own, barely keeping his family fed. My father did the same, but he had a dream. Saved every penny, lived on nothing, finally bought those 20 acres I started with. He placed the hat back on his head, adjusting it with the same care he'd shown checking the aircraft's control surfaces. When I got back from Vietnam, I took those 20 acres and a lot of people laughed. Just like you laugh today. Bank managers, equipment dealers, buyers, they all looked at me the same way you did. But you know what they didn't look at? He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, different from the bank statement, and held it out. Whitman took it automatically. Latest satellite imagery of our main operation, George explained. 12,000 acres of prime farmland. Organic certification across 3 states. Processing facilities, distribution centers, and a fleet of trucks that'll soon include this jet. All built by a man you wouldn't let in your front door. Someone in the back whispered, "Holy shit." Whitman stared at the satellite image, his hands shaking slightly. The property boundaries outlined on the photo seemed to stretch forever, a patchwork of green and gold that represented millions in revenue. Whitman started, then stopped. For the first time, he seemed at a loss for words. The contract, George said, turning back to Bradford. Page 3 mentioned maintenance schedules. Want to review that section? Bradford jumped to attention, fumbling with the papers. Yes, of course. The maintenance package includes. Mr. Miller. Whitman interrupted again, his voice taking on an almost pleading quality. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. Let me personally show you our premium service package. We reserve it for our most distinguished clients. Distinguished. George turned back to him. 20 minutes ago, you called me a poor farmer. 10 minutes ago, you were ready to have security escort me out. Now I'm distinguished ? The truth of it hung in the air like a physical thing. Someone near the cabin door muttered, "This is going viral for sure." That's not. I didn't mean. Whitman stumbled over his words. You meant exactly what you said, George replied calmly. Only difference is now you know what I'm worth. In dollars, At least, he settled back into his seat. Now, about that maintenance schedule. Do you have any idea who I am? Whitman suddenly burst out, his face mottled red. I'm the CEO of Elite Aviation. I sell jets to billionaires, to celebrities, to farmers, George cut in. If they can afford it, and if they'll still do business with you after today. The cabin went deadly quiet. Through the windows, dozens of phones were still recording. Tomorrow, the story would be everywhere. The CEO of Elite Aviation trying to throw out a multimillionaire farmer, all caught on video. Whitman must have realized it too. His face went from red to white. I'll have you blacklisted, he hissed. No aviation company in the country will. Mr. Whitman. Bradford's voice cracked like a whip. Everyone turned to look at the sales executive, who seemed surprised by his own outburst. He swallowed hard and continued, Sir, Mr. Miller's purchase would be our largest sale this quarter. And given the current situation, he gestured vaguely toward the hangar full of recording phones. George watched the reality sink in across Whitman's face. The viral videos, the PR nightmare, the inevitable news stories about discrimination in the private aviation industry. All because he couldn't see past a pair of overalls and a straw hat. The contract, George said again, turning back to the papers. Page 3. Bradford rushed to help, but his hands were shaking so badly he dropped several pages. As he scrambled to collect them, more executives crowded into the cabin, each trying to position themselves as allies in this suddenly shifting landscape. Mr. Miller, my card. If you ever need financing, our investment firm would love to discuss. George held up one weathered hand, silencing the flood of attention. Came here to buy a jet, he said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, either we finish this deal, or I walk out that door and take my business elsewhere. Your choice. Whitman stood frozen, his career seemingly flashing before his eyes. The satellite image trembled in his hands. We. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to regain control. Of course we want your business, Mr. Miller. Elite Aviation would be honored. Save it, George cut him off. Contract. Page 3. One last time, Bradford finally managed to get the papers in order, pointing to the relevant section with a shaking finger. The maintenance intervals are specified here, with our platinum service package. Standard package will do, George said, studying the terms, same as any other buyer. But sir, Bradford protested, the platinum package. Don't need special treatment, George interrupted. Never have. Just need fair business. Can you manage that, Mr. Whitman? All eyes turned to the CEO, who stood rigid in the cabin doorway. The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning beyond a simple business transaction. Through the windows, the morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the hangar floor. George could see his old pickup truck through the glass, still parked out front like a rusty exclamation point in a lot full of luxury cars. The silence stretched out, broken only by the distant sound of aircraft taking off from the main runway. In that moment, everyone in the cabin knew they were watching more than a sale. They were watching a reckoning. Whitman's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Mr. Miller, before we proceed, I'll need to verify these financial statements personally. The cabin's air conditioning hummed quietly, but sweat beaded on Bradford's forehead. George sat perfectly still, one hand resting on the contract. Everything's already verified, Bradford interjected quickly. Our financial department. I want to see it again, Whitman snapped. All of it, every account, every asset, every transaction. George reached into his pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet again. The other executives in the cabin leaned forward unconsciously, memories of the first revelation still fresh in their minds. My papers are in order, George said quietly. Have been since before I walked in. Prove it, Whitman challenged, his voice tight. Prove you're not just some. He caught himself, but the unspoken words hung in the air. George opened his wallet with deliberate slowness. The leather creaked, a sound he'd heard thousands of times over decades of use. Inside, behind the transparent sleeve where most people kept family photos, he kept something else, something that made Whitman's eyes widen. That's... Whitman started. My first deposit slip, George said, removing the yellowed paper carefully. $20,000. Life savings back then. Used it to buy those first 20 acres everyone thought would fail. He laid it on the table next to the purchase agreement. Then he started pulling out more papers, each one preserved carefully in his wallet like others might keep precious photographs. Loan approval for my first tractor. Property deed for the initial land purchase. First major contract with a national distributor. Each document joined the others on the table. Keep these to remind me where I came from, and to show people like you where I'm going. Someone in the back of the cabin whispered, "Is that a Presidential Medal of Freedom citation?" Agricultural innovation, George confirmed, adding that paper to the growing collection. Last year, sustainable farming practices. Whitman stared at the documents, his face a mix of emotions he couldn't quite control. These are impressive, but I still need current financials. George nodded to Bradford, who jumped to action, pulling up files on his tablet. Full financial portfolio, Bradford said, handing the device to Whitman. Verified by 3 separate banks. Asset listings, revenue streams, credit ratings. His voice grew stronger with each item. Mr. Miller's company shows consistent growth over 30 years. No defaults, no late payments, no financial irregularities of any kind. Whitman scrolled through the documents, his finger moving faster and faster. Each swipe revealed another page of success, another proof of empire. These numbers, he muttered. This can't be. Oh, it can, came a new voice from the cabin door. Everyone turned to see an older man in an expensive suit, his presence commanding immediate attention. And it is, Mr. Roberts, Bradford breathed. I didn't know you were here. James Roberts, the man introduced himself, stepping into the cabin. Of Williams and Roberts, Mr. Miller's legal counsel. He fixed Whitman with a stern gaze. A position that's become increasingly relevant in the last hour, I'd say. Whitman's face paled slightly. You've been watching, along with about 50,000 others, so far, Roberts replied, holding up his phone. Live streams have a way of traveling fast these days. George remained seated, his expression unchanged. Didn't call you, James? No, you didn't, Roberts agreed. But when my phone started blowing up with notifications about my biggest client being harassed at Elite Aviation, I thought I should drop by. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Good thing I was only 20 minutes away. Whitman swallowed hard. No one is harassing anyone. We're simply performing due diligence. Due diligence? Roberts raised an eyebrow. Is that what we're calling public humiliation and discrimination these days? Now see here. Whitman started. No, you see here. Roberts cut him off. I've got 50,000 witnesses watching my client being treated like a second-class citizen in your facility. I got recorded evidence of multiple discriminatory statements from you personally. And I've got a man whose net worth could buy this entire operation 3 times over being asked to prove he belongs here. He paused. Want to guess how this plays out in court? The cabin went silent except for the soft whir of the air conditioning. Outside, the crowd had grown larger, phones still recording everything through the windows. That won't be necessary, George said quietly. Still just here to buy a jet. Roberts turned to his client. George, under the circumstances, George interrupted, we're either going to finish this deal proper, or we're going to walk away. He looked at Whitman. Your choice, Mr. CEO. Whitman stood frozen, the tablet still in his hands displaying millions in assets and decades of success. His eyes darted between George, Roberts, and the growing crowd outside. The standard contract will be fine, he managed finally. Standard contract, George agreed. Standard terms, standard treatment. He picked up his pen. That's all I wanted from the start. Bradford rushed to arrange the papers, his hands steadier now that a resolution seemed in sight. But Whitman stepped forward one last time. He cleared his throat. I need one more thing. Roberts' eyes narrowed. Mr. Whitman, I strongly advise. Your business plan, Whitman blurted out. For the jet. I need to see it. George looked up from the contract. Excuse me? Proof that you can utilize an aircraft of this caliber. Whitman's words came faster now, a desperate edge to them. Flight plans, maintenance projections, crew arrangements. You're asking a certified commercial pilot with 40 years of aviation experience to prove he can handle a private jet. Roberts' voice could have frozen hell, after his already demonstrated full financial capability. But George held up his hand. From his portfolio, he pulled out another set of documents. Projected flight paths between primary facilities, he began, laying out papers one by one. fuel consumption analysis compared to current transportation costs, maintenance schedules aligned with harvest seasons, crew certifications, including my own current licenses. Each document hit the table like a quiet thunderclap. Revenue projections showing cost recovery within 18 months through improved logistics and market responsiveness. The cabin was dead silent. Bradford stared at the documents with his mouth slightly open. Even Roberts looked impressed. "I didn't come here to prove anything to you, Mr. Whitman," George continued. "But I've learned that sometimes education is the best cure for ignorance." He gestured to the papers. "Take your time. Read carefully. Maybe learn something about judging books by their covers." Whitman picked up the business plan with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second, his face showing a mix of shock and dawning comprehension. "This is—" he started. "Professional," Roberts finished for him. "Like everything my client does." He checked his phone again. "Oh, and we're up to 70,000 viewers now." Trending on several platforms, George remained focused on the contract in front of him, seemingly unconcerned with social media metrics or viral fame. His weathered hands held the pen steady, ready to sign. "Well, Mr. Whitman," he asked without looking up, "are we doing business today, or should I take my poor farmer money elsewhere?" The question hung in the air like morning mist over fields, waiting to be burned away by either the sun of acceptance or the wind of rejection. The next few seconds would determine more than just a sale. They would define a moment in both men's lives, captured forever by dozens of recording phones and thousands of watching eyes. Whitman set down George's business plan with shaking hands. The sound of phones clicking and recording continued outside the jet's windows, a digital chorus documenting every moment. Whitman cleared his throat. "I had no idea the scope of your operations." "Most don't," George replied, still focused on the contract. Too busy looking at the hat to see what's under it. Bradford hovered nearby, papers clutched to his chest. "Should I prepare the final documentation, Mr. Whitman?" Before the CEO could respond, another commotion erupted at the cabin door. A woman in an impeccable business suit pushed her way in, tablet in hand. "Mr. Whitman," she said urgently, "the board is calling." They've seen the live streams, the color drained from Whitman's face. "Already? It's everywhere," she continued. "Social media is exploding. Major news outlets are picking up the story. They're calling it Farmer vs. Elite." Robert smiled thinly. "Catchy title." "The board wants to speak with you immediately," the woman pressed. "They're particularly interested in the potential discrimination lawsuit." "There won't be a lawsuit," George interrupted, looking up from the contract. "Not if we finish this sale proper." All eyes turned to him. The woman with the tablet blinked in surprise. "But sir, given the circumstances—" "The circumstances," George said firmly, "are that I came here to buy a jet. Nothing more." He turned to Whitman. "Unless you're still questioning my ability to do so." Whitman wiped sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. No, of course not. The sale can proceed immediately." "Good." George returned to the contract. "Bradford, walk me through the maintenance terms again." As Bradford eagerly launched into the details, more people crowded around the cabin door. News had spread through the aviation community like wildfire. Industry executives, potential buyers, and curious onlookers all strained to catch a glimpse of the farmer who'd brought elite aviation to its knees. "Is it true?" someone whispered loudly. "About his company?" Another voice responded, "Look up Miller Agricultural right now. The numbers are insane. 12,000 acres. Presidential medal. Organic certification across 3 states." The whispers grew, a steady stream of revelation and disbelief. Phones lit up as people Googled George's company, each search revealing another layer of his success. "Their distribution network covers half the country," someone announced. "Major contracts with every major grocery chain. Latest valuation puts them at over $500 million, another added. And he still drives a pickup truck. Still works the fields himself." George ignored the chatter, his pen moving steadily across the contract pages. Each signature was careful, deliberate, just like every other business decision he'd made in his life. "Mr. Miller," a young executive called from the doorway, "is it true you're expanding into vertical farming and sustainable water management systems? What about the solar-powered processing facilities?" Robert stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "My client is busy completing a purchase." Media inquiries can be directed to our PR department. But the questions continued, each one revealing another facet of George's empire that Whitman had failed to recognize. The drought-resistant seed program, agricultural technology patents, international consulting contracts. Bradford's voice trembled with excitement as he pointed out each signature line. Initial here, and here. Full signature on this page. Whitman stood to the side, watching his pristine world of elite aviation crack and reshape itself around the man in overalls. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from board members, PR teams, and damage control specialists. The board wants to know, his assistant whispered urgently, if we should prepare a formal apology statement. Not necessary, George said without looking up. His hearing, honed by years of working around farm machinery, caught every whispered word. Just need fair treatment, same as anyone else. A new figure appeared at the cabin door, a distinguished-looking man in his 70s, wearing a suit that cost more than most cars. George, he called out. George Miller, is that you? George finally looked up, a flash of recognition crossing his face. Senator Williams, thought that was your truck out front, the senator chuckled. Still driving that same old Ford? Still runs fine, George replied. Didn't expect to see you here. I'm on the board, the senator explained, stepping into the cabin. He turned to Whitman, whose face had gone even paler. Though I'm quite interested to hear why one of my oldest friends and most respected agricultural advisors was treated so poorly in our facility. Whitman's mouth opened and closed without sound. The senator continued. George here has been advising Congress on sustainable farming practices for the past decade. His innovations in water conservation alone have saved the agricultural industry billions. He placed a hand on George's shoulder. Not to mention his work with veteran rehabilitation programs, teaching former soldiers to farm. How many former vets have you employed now, George? 217, George replied quietly. Good men and women. Just needed a chance. The whispers outside grew louder. Someone pulled up a news article about Miller Agricultural's veteran employment program. Another found a video of George's presidential medal ceremony. Speaking of chances, the senator said, turning back to Whitman. I'm curious why a valued customer had such difficulty making a simple purchase today. There was no difficulty, Whitman said quickly. Just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding caught on video from 12 different angles, Roberts added helpfully. Currently being shared across every major social media platform. Bradford, sensing the gravity of the moment, hurriedly gathered the signed contract pages. Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Miller. The aircraft can be ready for delivery within 2 weeks, George said, standing up. After harvest. The senator laughed. Always business first with you, George. Remember when you delayed that White House dinner because it conflicted with planting season? More whispers erupted outside. The story of George's empire grew with each passing minute, each new detail making Whitman's earlier behavior seem more egregious. Is it true he turned down a cabinet position? Donated last year's profits to rural education. Built 3 teaching farms for underprivileged youth. George gathered his papers quietly, tucking them into his worn portfolio with the same care he'd shown his wallet full of memories. Need to get back to the fields, he said simply. Corn won't wait on account of business meetings. The senator shook his head, smiling. Same old George. Taking care of business in your own way. He turned to Whitman. I trust there won't be any further misunderstandings. No, sir, Whitman managed. Absolutely not. George adjusted his hat and moved toward the cabin door. The crowd outside parted like water, phone still recording every moment. As he passed Whitman, he paused. You know what the difference is between us, Mr. Whitman? He asked quietly. Whitman swallowed hard. What's that, Mr. Miller? I never had to prove myself to my workers. They see me in the fields every day, doing the same work they do. He gestured to his clothes. These aren't a costume. They're who I am, who I've always been. He looked around the cabin. All this? It's just tools to do the job better. Nothing more. The truth of it hung in the air, heavy as August humidity. Every phone captured the moment, every ear strained to hear the exchange that would undoubtedly be quoted in tomorrow's headlines. As George stepped out of the jet's cabin, the hangar erupted in activity. Executives who had earlier avoided eye contact now pressed forward, business cards extended. Phones recorded his every move, capturing the moment when power shifted so dramatically it left scorch marks on Elite Aviation's pristine floor. Mr. Miller, a moment of your time. Our investment firm would love to discuss, if you're considering expansion into. Roberts moved smoothly to run interference, but George raised his hand. The crowd fell silent. Appreciate the interest, he said, voice carrying across the hangar. But got fields waiting. Anyone serious about business can contact my office. During regular hours, a young woman in a designer suit pushed forward. Mr. Miller, I represent the Wall Street Journal. Could you comment on? No comment needed, George interrupted. Story's simple enough. Farmer came to buy a jet. Eventually, they let him. He adjusted his hat. That's all there is to it. Whitman hurried down the jet stairs, his expensive shoes clicking on each step. Mr. Miller, please. Let me escort you to my office. We can discuss additional services. Already got what I came for, George replied, patting his portfolio where the signed contract sat. Jet'll be ready in 2 weeks. After harvest. But surely we can offer you. Offer me what? George turned to face him. Special treatment? Preferred status? VIP services? He shook his head. Never needed any of that. Just needed fair business. Simple as that. The senator, still watching from the jet's doorway, chuckled. Still the same George Miller who testified before Congress in his work boots. This sparked another round of whispers and furious Googling from the crowd. More details of George's life emerged in excited murmurs. Found his congressional testimony. Look at these agricultural patents. His company's market share in organic produce. Bradford hustled forward with a thick folder. Mr. Miller, your welcome package. It includes all the premium, standard package, George corrected him. Like we agreed. But sir, given your status, my status. George's voice carried a hint of steel. My status is farmer. Always has been. Always will be. He looked around the hangar. All this? The jet, the contracts, the business? Just tools to work the land better. Nothing more, nothing less. A distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit stepped forward. Mr. Miller, I'm Richard Chen from Pacific Agricultural Investments. We'd very much like to discuss, like I said, George interrupted, regular business hours. Through proper channels. He patted his overalls. Right now, these clothes have work waiting for them. Whitman made one last attempt. Mr. Miller, about earlier. I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, George cut him off. You saw what you wanted to see. Made judgments based on looks. Happens all the time. He adjusted his hat. Question is, what'll you see next time someone like me walks through those doors? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Phones captured every word, every gesture. Tomorrow's business schools would probably use this moment as a case study in prejudice and power dynamics. We. Whitman struggled to find words. Tell you what, George said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, worn business card. Not the glossy kind that had been thrust at him all morning, but a simple one, printed on basic card stock. You figure out the answer. Give me a call. Maybe we can do business again. Whitman took the card like it was made of gold. Others in the crowd leaned forward, trying to glimpse this simple piece of paper that had suddenly become more valuable than their expensive, embossed versions. The senator stepped down from the jet, placing a hand on George's shoulder. Need a ride back to the farm, old friend? Got my truck, George replied, nodding toward the parking lot where his mud-spattered Ford still sat among the luxury vehicles. Of course you do, the senator laughed. Same truck you drove to the White House last year. More whispers, more furious typing on phones. The story grew with each passing minute, each revealed detail making the morning's events more extraordinary. Mr. Miller, called a voice from the crowd. What would you say to other farmers who dream of achieving what you have? George paused, considering the question. The hangar fell silent, phones raised to capture his response. Dreams are good, he said finally. But dirt's better. Can't grow anything in dreams. Need to get your hands in the soil. Need to work the land. Need to understand that success doesn't wear a suit or drive a fancy car. He looked around the hangar. Success wears whatever gets the job done. Drives whatever keeps running. Lives whatever life stays true to itself. He turned to go, but Whitman called out one last time. The board, he said desperately. They'll want to know. How can we make this right? George stopped but didn't turn around. Already told you. Treat the next farmer who walks through those doors like a customer, not a curiosity. Treat the next person in work clothes like a businessman, not a burden. He started walking again. Simple as that. The crowd parted before him, phones still recording. His boots left faint marks on the polished floor, each step a reminder of where he'd come from and who he remained. Outside, the morning sun had climbed higher. His truck sat waiting, its mud-spattered sides a testament to early morning work in the fields. Before he reached it, a young man in a janitor's uniform approached hesitantly. "Sir," the young man said, I've got a small farm. 5 acres. Everyone says it's too small to make it work. But George stopped. For the first time that morning, his face softened into a genuine smile. "Come by the office," he said, reaching for another of his simple business cards. "Regular hours. We'll talk soil composition and crop rotation." He looked the young man in the eye. 5 acres is plenty to start. I started with an even crazier dream and work clothes just like yours. Behind them, the crowd of executives and reporters watched this final exchange, phones capturing the moment when the most powerful man in the hangar chose to talk farming with a janitor. The senator, standing at the hangar entrance, shook his head with a smile. Only George Miller could turn a jet purchase into an agricultural mentorship opportunity. George climbed into his truck, the engine starting with a reliable rumble of machinery well maintained despite its age. Through his windshield, he could see Whitman still standing in the hangar doorway, the simple business card clutched in his hand, watching as a man worth hundreds of millions drove away in a 20-year-old pickup truck. The morning's drama faded behind him as George turned onto the main road. He had crops to check, workers to coordinate, and a harvest to prepare for. The jet would be ready in 2 weeks, after the real work was done. In his rearview mirror, Elite Aviation's gleaming hangar grew smaller, its pristine walls forever changed by a farmer who had taught its occupants the true meaning of worth. George's truck rolled to a stop at the hangar entrance. A security guard who had earlier eyed him with suspicion now rushed to raise the gate, offering a hasty salute. But something made George pause. He rolled down his window, the manual crank squeaking with age. "Need to say something," he announced, stepping out of the truck. The crowd that had started to disperse quickly regathered. Phones emerged again like flowers following the sun. Whitman, who had been retreating to his office, spun around so fast he nearly tripped. "Mr. Miller," Bradford called out nervously. "Is there a problem with the contract?" "No problem with the paper," George replied. "But got something to say before I leave." The hangar fell silent. Even the distant sound of aircraft seemed to dim. George walked back toward the group, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. He stopped in the center of the space, where just hours before he'd been mocked and dismissed. "Been farming for 40 years, he began, his voice carrying easily through the quiet hangar. "Seen all kinds of weather. Good seasons, bad seasons. Droughts that crack the earth, floods that drown the seeds. But you know what's harder than any of that?" No one spoke. Phones recorded silently. "People's minds," George continued. "Their set ideas about who belongs where, what success looks like, who gets to walk through which doors." He adjusted his hat. "Had a lot of doors shut in my face over the years. Banks that wouldn't lend, buyers who wouldn't meet, dealers who wouldn't sell." Whitman shifted uncomfortably, but George wasn't looking at him. Each time it happened, had 2 choices. Could get angry, let it burn me up inside. Or could get better, prove them wrong through work. He gestured around the hangar. Today wasn't about buying a jet. Wasn't about proving anything. Was about business, pure and simple. The senator nodded slowly from his position near the door. "But since we're here," George continued, "might as well make it mean something." He turned to face Whitman directly. "You run this company. Got power to change things. So I'm asking you, what happens next time someone like me walks through that door?" The CEO opened his mouth, then closed it. The question wasn't rhetorical. We'll treat them with respect," Whitman managed finally. "Respect's earned," George corrected. "Talking about fairness. Equal treatment. Simple courtesy that doesn't depend on the size of someone's bank account or the cut of their clothes." A younger executive near the back called out, "But how can we know who's really?" "That's the point," George cut him off. "You can't know. Shouldn't need to know. Business is business. Money's money. Whether it comes from Wall Street or Main Street. whether it's carried in a leather briefcase or a worn wallet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old wallet again. The crowd tensed, expecting another revelation. Instead, George held it up for all to see. "This wallet bought my first tractor," he said. "Paid for my first seed. Carried every receipt, every bill, every hard-earned dollar that built what I got now." He turned it over in his weathered hands. Nothing special about it. Just leather and time. But it's never been too poor to hold honest money. Never been too plain to pay good debts. Roberts, still standing near the jet, smiled slightly. He'd seen this side of his client before, in boardrooms and congressional hearings, the simple wisdom that cut through corporate pretense like a plow through spring soil. "So here's what's going to happen," George continued. "I'm going to drive back to my farm. Got crops that need tending, workers waiting on instructions, decisions that won't make themselves. This jet deal," he patted his portfolio, "just another tool for the work. Nothing more." He looked around the hangar, meeting eyes that now stayed fixed on his instead of sliding away. "But tomorrow, next week, next year, someone else is going to walk through those doors. Might be wearing overalls. Might have dirt under their nails. Might drive a truck that's seen better days. And how you treat them." He paused. "That's going to say more about you than it ever will about them." The silence in the hangar was absolute. Even the phones seemed to record more quietly. "Had a choice today," George said. "Could have walked out when the laughing started. Could have called lawyers when the insults flew. Could have made this about revenge instead of business." He shook his head. "But that's not how I was raised. Not how I built what I built. Success isn't about proving people wrong. It's about proving yourself right." Whitman stepped forward, his face a mix of emotions. "Mr. Miller, don't want apologies," George interrupted. "Don't need them. What I want is change. Real change. Not because of who I turned out to be, but because of who the next person might be." He turned in a slow circle, taking in the whole crowd. Every fortune starts somewhere. Every empire begins with a single decision, a single dream, a single person willing to work harder than anyone thinks they should. His voice carried to every corner of the hangar. "I'm not special. Just stubborn. Just willing to keep going when others said stop. Willing to keep building when others said quit." The senator nodded, remembering similar speeches in front of Congress. Simple words carrying complex truths. "So take this morning as a lesson," George continued. "Not about me. Not about my money or my company or this jet. Take it as a lesson about assumptions. About judgment. About the cost of looking down on people you think can't reach your height." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a handful of his simple business cards. "Starting today, my office will be keeping track. Every farmer, every worker, every person in work clothes who comes through these doors, we'll be watching how they are treated. Not through lawyers or lawsuits, but through word of mouth. Through the networks that connect every field and farm in this country." He set the cards on a nearby table. "Treat them fair. You'll never hear from me again. Treat them wrong." He paused. "Well, let's just say farmers talk. Word spreads faster than weeds in spring." The implied threat was clear but didn't need to be stated. In an industry built on reputation, word of mouth could be more powerful than any legal action. "Choice is yours," George finished. "Same choice it's always been. Same choice everyone faces when someone different walks through their door." He turned to go, then stopped one last time. "And remember something else," he added. "Success isn't about what you take. It's about what you leave behind. Today, you all get to decide what that'll be." The impact of George's words hung in the air like morning dew. Whitman stepped forward, his designer shoes clicking on the hangar floor. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice different now, stripped of its earlier condescension. "Before you go, there's something we need to do." George turned, one hand still on his truck's door handle. "Papers are signed. Deal's done." "Not quite." Whitman gestured to his assistant, who hurried forward with a sleek laptop. "There's been a board decision. Just came through." The crowd pressed closer, phones still recording. Bradford clutched his tablet, eyes darting between his CEO and the farmer who had changed everything. "Elite Aviation," Whitman continued, "would like to establish a new program. The Miller Initiative for Agricultural Aviation." George's expression didn't change. "Not interested in having my name on anything." "This isn't about your name," Whitman replied. "It's about what you said. About change." He opened the laptop, turning it to show a quickly drafted proposal. A dedicated program for agricultural businesses. Fair financing. Standardized treatment. No special questions. No extra requirements. The senator stepped forward, peering at the screen. Looks legitimate, George. They are proposing preferential rates for agricultural businesses, especially small and medium-sized operations. Don't want preferential, George said firmly. Just want fair. Equal rates then, Whitman amended quickly. But with dedicated staff who understand agricultural needs. People who know the difference between harvest seasons and fiscal quarters. Who understand that a farmer's time is worth just as much as a CEO's. George studied the proposal, his weathered hands resting on the laptop's pristine surface. Around him, the crowd waited in silence. And who's going to run this program? He asked finally. Whitman gestured to someone in the back. The young janitor George had spoken to earlier stepped forward nervously. Jake here, Whitman said, mentioned he has farming experience. 5 acres, wasn't it? The janitor nodded. Yes, sir. Small operation, but growing, George finished for him. He looked at Whitman. You're offering him a job? A position, Whitman corrected. As our agricultural liaison. Someone who knows both worlds. Who can make sure what happened today never happens again. The janitor's eyes widened. Mr. Whitman offered to let me work flexible hours, sir, so I can still tend to my farm. George studied the young man's face, seeing in it the same dream he'd carried 40 years ago. Your choice, son. But remember, respect is earned in the fields before it's earned in an office. Yes, sir, Jake replied. I plan to keep working my land. Just, maybe help others like me along the way. Bradford stepped forward with another set of papers. We've already drafted the initial program guidelines. Equal treatment guaranteed. Standard documentation only. No additional requirements based on, he swallowed, appearance or occupation. George took the papers, reading them carefully. His eyes moved line by line, the same way he read seed catalogs and equipment manuals, missing nothing. Need one change, he said finally. Whitman tensed. Whatever you want, program needs a different name. George handed the papers back. Call it the Fair Start Initiative. No need for my name on it. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone in the back called out, But sir, your influence. My influence is in the fields. George cut them off. In the work. In the example. He looked at Jake. Success isn't about whose name is on the program. It's about who gets help by it. Whitman nodded slowly, understanding finally reaching his eyes. Fair Start Initiative it is. He turned to his assistant. Make the change. Send it to the board for immediate approval. Phones captured the moment as Whitman extended his hand to George. Not the condescending gesture from earlier, but a genuine offer of respect. Thank you, Whitman said quietly, for teaching us something valuable today. George shook his hand firmly. Lesson's not about what I taught. It's about what you learned. He turned to Jake, who still stood nervously nearby. Stop by the farm next week. After your shift here, show you a few things about crop rotation that might help with those 5 acres. The young man's face lit up. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And Jake, George added, keep those work clothes. Best outfit a farmer can wear is one that's not afraid of honest dirt. Roberts approached with the final purchase documents. Everything's in order, George. Jet will be ready for delivery in 2 weeks. After harvest, George reminded him. After harvest, Roberts agreed with a smile. Bradford hurried forward with a small box. Your keys, Mr. Miller. Standard package, as requested. He paused. Though we did add one small thing, if you'll permit it. George opened the box. Inside, along with the keys and documents, lay a small metal plaque designed to mount in the jet's cabin. Success isn't about what you take, but what you leave behind, Bradford read. Your words, sir. We thought they belonged in the aircraft. As a reminder, for the first time that day, George's expression softened slightly. Might be able to live with that. The senator clapped him on the shoulder. Always did have a way of making your point, George. Though usually with fewer witnesses. He gestured at the phone still recording everything. Ain't about witnesses, George replied. About doing what's right. Rest takes care of itself. He turned to Whitman one last time. 2 weeks. After harvest. Have Jake handle the paperwork. Good way for him to learn both sides of the business. Whitman nodded. We'll be ready. And Mr. Miller, those doors you mentioned, they'll stay open. For everyone. See that they do, George replied. Farmers talk. Remember? He climbed into his truck, the engine starting with the same reliable rumble. Through the windshield, he could see the crowd still watching, phones still recording, faces showing various degrees of respect, shame, and understanding. The security guard rushed to open the gate, offering another salute. This time, George returned it, a simple nod between working men. As his truck pulled away from Elite Aviation, George caught a glimpse in his rearview mirror. Jake the janitor standing straight and proud in his work clothes, Whitman beside him already discussing plans for the Fair Start initiative. And beyond them, the sleek jet that would soon help expand an empire built on dirt, dreams, and determination. The morning's drama faded behind him as the familiar scent of his fields drew closer. He had crops to check, workers to guide, and a harvest to bring in. The jet would wait. It always came down to the same thing: the work, the land, and the simple truth that success grew from the ground up, not from the top down. 2 weeks passed exactly as George knew they would, with dirt under his fingernails and the rhythm of harvest setting the pace. He stood in his fields now, the morning sun painting the sky in shades of promise. Around him, combines moved in practice patterns, gathering the season's work into their hoppers. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably Bradford, calling again about the jet delivery. George let it ring. Harvest came first. Always had, always would. Mr. Miller. Jake's voice carried across the field. The young man jogged toward him, work boots kicking up dust. He kept his janitor's uniform, but now it bore the honest stains of farm work. Field's looking good, George said, nodding toward Jake's 5 acres visible in the distance. That rotation plan's working out. Yes, sir. Yields up 30% from last year. Jake caught his breath. But, sir, they're waiting at the hangar. Mr. Whitman sent me himself. George checked his watch. Told them after harvest. Yes, sir, but... Jake gestured at the nearly finished field. This is your last section. They got everything ready. The Fair Start initiative launches today, too. George surveyed his land. The combines were indeed nearly done, their methodical progress leaving neat rows in their wake. His workers moved with the efficiency of experience, each person knowing their role in the dance of harvest. Sir, Jake pressed. There's quite a crowd gathered. Crowd? George turned to him. Thought this was just a delivery. Jake shifted his feet. Well, word got around. Other farmers are there. Lots of them. People you've helped over the years. They want to see. See what? George asked, though he already knew the answer. See you finish what you started, Jake replied. See the farmer who changed things. George sighed, looking back at his field. The last combine was making its final turn. Mr. Whitman's different now, Jake continued. The whole place is. Last week, a farmer came in wearing muddy boots. They rolled out the red carpet for him. Didn't even ask to see his financials first. Shouldn't have needed me to teach them that, George said quietly. No, sir. But you did. And now? Jake gestured toward town. Now everyone's watching to see what happens next. George's phone buzzed again. This time he checked it. A message from the senator. Field's done, old friend. Time to show them what success really looks like. He looked up at his land, at the work of generations coming to fruit once again. The last combine was finishing its row. All right, he said finally. Let's go see about this jet. They took George's truck, of course. Jake offered to drive his newer vehicle, but George just shook his head. This old Ford's seen every step of the journey. Deserves to see this part too. As they approached Elite Aviation, George could see Jake hadn't exaggerated. The parking lot was full, not with luxury cars this time, but with trucks. Farm trucks, work trucks, the kind of vehicles that carried dreams and dirt in equal measure. Word spread through the farming community, Jake explained. After what happened 2 weeks ago, well, people wanted to be here. George pulled into the same spot he'd used before. His mud-spattered truck still stood out, but now it was in good company. The hangar doors were wide open. Inside, George could see a crowd larger than before, but different. Work boots outnumbered dress shoes. Calloused hands clutched phones ready to record. Faces weathered by sun and wind watched expectantly. Whitman stood at the entrance, but his stance had changed. Gone was the arrogant tilt of his head, replaced by something approaching genuine respect. Mr. Miller, he called out. Right on time. Harvest done, George replied simply. He walked toward the hangar, aware of every eye following his progress. The crowd parted, but not from disdain this time. These were his people, farmers, workers, dreamers who'd heard the story of a man who stood his ground in overalls and a straw hat. The jet gleamed under the hangar lights, but it wasn't alone. Beside it stood a simple podium with a Fair Start Initiative banner. Jake hurried ahead to take his place behind it, straightening his work clothes proudly. Before we complete the delivery, Whitman said, we thought, that is, we hoped you might say a few words. George looked at the crowd. He saw faces he recognized, farmers he'd advised, workers he'd hired, young people he'd mentored. But he also saw elite aviation staff, standing respectfully in their suits and ties, watching and waiting. Not much for speeches, George started, but a voice called out from the crowd. Tell them about the dream, Mr. Miller. Tell them how you started. It was one of his first workers, now a successful farmer himself. Others joined in. Tell them about the 20 acres, about the first tractor, about never giving up. George raised his hand, and the hangar fell silent. Dreams are simple things, he began, his voice carrying easily through the space. Like seeds. Don't look like much at first. Most folks can't see what they'll grow into. He gestured at the jet. This here? Just another tool. Like a tractor, like a combine. Means to an end. He turned to face the elite aviation staff. 2 weeks ago, stood in this spot and talked about doors. About who gets to walk through them. About judgment and worth and the look of success. He adjusted his hat. Today, looking around, I see those doors are opening. See faces that wouldn't have made it past security before. See respect being given, not because of bank accounts, but because it's right. Whitman nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. That's the real harvest, George continued. Not this jet, not the Fair Start program, but the change in how we see each other, how we treat each other, how we judge what makes a person worthy of respect. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his worn wallet. The crowd leaned forward, many having heard about this moment from the viral videos. Been carrying this wallet since my first acre. Holds more than money, holds memories. Proof that dreams don't care what clothes you wear or what truck you drive. He held it up. Success isn't in the leather of a wallet or the cut of a suit. It's in the work, in the dirt, in the willing to keep going when others quit. Jake stepped forward from behind the podium, his eyes bright. Mr. Miller changed more than policies, he announced. He changed minds, changed hearts, showed us that true worth isn't about appearance or privilege, it's about character, about work ethic, about treating everyone with the respect they deserve, not the respect we think they've earned. The crowd murmured in agreement. Phones recorded every word. Today, Jake continued, we're not just delivering a jet. We're not just launching an initiative. We're starting something bigger, something that should have been true all along. The idea that every dream deserves a fair chance. Every worker deserves respect. Every person deserves to be judged by their character, not their clothes. George nodded slightly, pride showing in his eyes as he watched the young man speak. The jet's ready, Mr. Miller, Bradford called from near the aircraft. Everything's prepared exactly to standard specifications. Just like you wanted. George walked toward the plane, his work boots echoing on the hangar floor. The sound mixed with the clicks of phones and the soft murmur of the crowd. One last thing, he said, turning back to face everyone. Success isn't a destination. Is it a jet or a program or a bank account? Success is what you leave behind. What grows from your work? What changes because you stood your ground? He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a handful of simple business cards, the same kind that had become almost legendary in the farming community. My office is always open. Doors always unlocked. Just like it should be everywhere. He looked directly at Whitman. Remember that? The CEO nodded solemnly. We will, Mr. Miller. You have my word. George climbed the steps into his new jet, pausing at the top to look back at the gathered crowd. Farmers and executives, workers and owners, all watching together as a man in overalls and a straw hat showed them what success really looked like. Time to get back to work, he said simply. Fields don't plow themselves. The hangar erupted in applause. Not the polite kind from 2 weeks ago, but the genuine appreciation of people who understood the value of work, of dreams, and of standing your ground. As George settled into the pilot's seat, his calloused hands finding their place on the controls. He could see his old truck through the windscreen. It sat proudly among the other farm vehicles, a reminder of where he'd come from and who he'd always be. The jet's engines hummed to life, a different sound from his combines but serving the same purpose, tools for the work, nothing more. Through the window, he could see Jake standing tall in his work clothes, Whitman beside him with newfound respect in his stance, and a hangar full of people who had learned that success didn't always wear a suit. "Clear for takeoff, Mr. Miller," the tower radioed. George smiled slightly, adjusted his hat, and prepared to take his dream to new heights. Still a farmer, still true to himself, still showing the world that the greatest legacy isn't what you gain, but what you change along the way.